Right. So I've got, I think I can call him a friend, Peter Freeth, with me, NLP trainer. I don't know. We're going to hear more about his background. Pete, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for having me.
Oh, no. Pleased to have you. Would you, now, people listen to this podcast, they're interested in NLP and they're interested in birth. Now, I know you've got some experience of birth, not personally, but you've had a couple of children, or
Yeah,
the partner has.
yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you just give us a little bit about your birth experience? Not yours. I'm waffling, Peter.
my
Would you?
my then my
Yes.
then wife.
Yes. Can you
Well,
remember back to that?
yeah. I mean, the first was 2000, and she was born at a quarter of midnight on a stormy summer. And it was hot, and
Wow.
there were summer storms. So when she was born, it was thunder and lightning, and it was hot, and it was humid, and she was born by emergency section.
Was she?
Yeah, in and out of the theatre all night, going in, getting her prepped, and then there was another emergency came along, so they whip her back out again, in again, out again.
God.
Tried to get the I don't know who it was, I don't know what they're called, registrar or something, to
Yeah.
do, is it the spinal or the epidural? She had 3 attempts at getting the needle in, couldn't.
Wow.
Paged the on-call consultant came out, got it in first time.
Yeah.
And when my daughter was born, she had a birthmark that was 3 red dots at the base of her spine.
No.
Yeah.
That is interesting.
And I had the strangest feeling after like a night or two of them being in the hospital, driving away one night. And I had a really odd emotional feeling that I couldn't quite figure out what it was. And I remember being in the car driving back from the hospital and realizing that the feeling was the feeling of falling in love.
Oh,
And
that's lovely.
so that was an interesting experience that I hadn't.
Falling in love with the baby.
Yeah.
Oh, how beautiful.
Nobody tells you this at parenting classes.
No.
They just tell you about what the different parts are called. Which is no use, really.
That is a lovely story, Peter.
And then the second one was
go on.
elective section. 13th Friday the 13th, the second was born in 2005. Based on the fact that nobody else wanted to have elective sections on Friday the 13th. So it was a quiet day, and we figured, the hospital's going to have more time, more resources, and so on. And the second is, it's interesting how similar but different they are, but they're very close, which is wonderful. So
it was an elective because she'd had
a section the first time.
Yeah.
And she figured that was what she wanted to do.
Yeah, and it's her choice, right? She had the choice. She had the choice. Yeah.
I think so. They may have kind of leaned in that direction. I can't remember.
Yeah, it's interesting. The first experience you talked about there. So you knew that it was going to be an emergency cesarean section.
No, well, only.
Did they say that?
Before.
Yes, but they said,
yeah,
it's an emergency cesarean section, and you were in and out of theatre.
Yeah.
Right. So from the moment they said it was an emergency to the moment your baby was born was quite a while, right?
About 4 or 5 hours.
Yeah, exactly. So I was talking to a conference of medical folk, lots of registrar obstetricians, and I said to them, we were talking about language and how language impacts our experience, And I said, so how many emergency cesarean sections that you do are really emergencies? And hardly anyone they put their hand up. So, well, hardly any. Hardly any are emergencies in the sense that they need doing within 7 minutes. So I said, why are you calling them emergencies then? Because the minute you say emergency, your average punter is thinking fire engine with alarm bells ringing.
Yeah.
And then we came to the conclusion that we'd be better off talking about non-scheduled non-scheduled cesarean birth. And that conveys the idea that we didn't plan to do a cesarean birth, but needs are that we need to, but it doesn't need to happen in the next 6 minutes.
I think looking back, she was past the due date, and obviously we know logically the due date's just, you know, completely made up anyway.
Yeah.
So she passed the due date, and it was in a period of time when, you know, medical intervention was the thing, and so they had her in for routine, for monitoring, and they didn't like the heartbeat, so they said, oh, she's in trouble, she's struggling, so we need to do an so I think even if they hadn't used the word emergency, the fact that she's struggling, she's heart rate,
all the language around that would have yeah. Do you know, I was on the training that I do, I know you know about it, a 2-day training. I was sharing about a woman in Germany who didn't consider her birth traumatic until she had something called a debrief. Now, this is where she goes to the midwife and they talk through the notes, right? So she sat there going through the notes, and she had a forceps birth. And the reason for the forceps birth in the notes, you ready? Kid you not? Lack of maternal effort. I mean, it's laughable, right?
Yeah,
but in that moment, the whole thing became her responsibility, her fault, and she was suffering. Anyway, thanks for sharing that, Peter. That was a curveball. So you've been involved with NLP for a long time,
right?
I mean, you have. So thinking back over your NLP journey, career, whatever you want to call it, what was it that attracted you to the model in the first place?
I think as a teenager, and late teens into 20s, I suppose, I read or tried to read a few books on psychology. I think to try and understand what I was experiencing in life. I suppose the way I would put it is, I suppose that a lot of people at some point in their lives wonder what it is that's wrong with them. And, you know, and often in relation to other people, why can't I do this? Or why is this difficult? Or why do people treat me this way? Or why do I treat people this way? Or whatever. And I found psychology books kind of unsatisfying because they just kind of had labels for things, but didn't give you any sort of help on what to do. It was all very sort of vague and unhelpful. And in 1990, well, in the 1990s, I worked in the telecoms industry. And the company I worked for in the internal sales training school ran a 3-day NLP course, because the guy who ran the sales training part of the training school was into NLP. So it was a kind of a favorite sort of thing of his, a personal project sort of thing. You ran a 3-day NLP course. And it was, everybody in the company talked about it and how good it was and all the amazing stuff that they learned. And so there was a long waiting list to get on the course, but I went on it. And yeah, it was great. What I liked was it was really heavy on the practicality. It was very much about experience and about practice and about being able to do things differently rather than just labeling the things that you think you do wrong.
Right.
And I came away from that with no desire to study more. I think I bought a book, NLP in 21 Days, it was called. That was nice.
Harry something. Yeah.
Yes, it's and somebody else. Yeah.
Well,
nice book.
Yeah,
Nice
Beryl Heather.
That's it.
Yeah,
Harry
from
Adler. Or Alder.
Alder
or Adler. Beryl. Yeah, nice book and you know, easy to digest. NLP in 21 lessons.
Yeah.
Really. And I just used to use the stuff that I'd learned and the stuff that I'd read. I just used to use it every day at work, in meetings, to understand people better or relate to people better or communicate more easily or to manage how I was feeling about things. And
I want to take a couple of steps back. So why? Because you're an engineer, aren't you? Of some variety.
By original education, yeah.
Yeah, so an engineer, telecoms industry. I'm interested in why you went into the telecoms industry, or why you wanted to be an engineer in the first place. Was that?
I didn't really. I was at school, did all right in O levels with next to no effort. Didn't fancy getting a job. Didn't really want to go to university because my school experience was to kind of beat the joy of learning out of me.
Yeah, like Mark Twain.
Right. So I went to a boys' grammar school, where the school's focus was on the school's reputation, not on the welfare or well-being of any of the kids who were there. We were just, numbers and uniforms and so I really hated that. And so I didn't really want more of that. So I didn't think I wanted to go to university. Right. I think the truth is I didn't know what I wanted to do. I didn't want to do anything. Right. I wasn't really interested in anything.
Right.
But the only thing I was really interested in was, tinkering with stuff and electronics and, something that I could while away.
Well, I bet you were an early computer user, weren't you? Did you have a Spectrum?
Not very much. I had a Sinclair ZX81.
Yeah, the very fact that you can say that, I think.
Yeah, no, I wasn't in the computer club at school or anything like that. So not very much into it, but I was into, I suppose, more electronics. But my dad was a maintenance electrician at a newspaper printing company, based in Birmingham. And so I think, he was always doing stuff and making stuff and tinkering with things and fixing things. And so I think it was, I have this theory that we're all attracted to the kind of job or activity that is closest to how we used to spend time with our dads.
Yeah.
I guess it could be mothers as well, the parent that we felt sort of closest to, but so whatever takes us back to having more time with them, which I guess is what
that makes sense, wouldn't it, from an early modeling that we do as children.
Yeah, and what is it that gets you more time and more love from somebody? So I was walking through the school reception area one day. The physics teacher said to me, "Oi, Freeth, do you want a job?" And I said, "What, like stapling leaflets for first years?" And he said, "No, real job, leave school, earn money." And I said, "Yeah, all right then." That was it.
Wow.
Went for the interview where the guy sat and grinned at me for 45 minutes. And the promise of the job was an apprenticeship in a company that did telephone systems, fire alarms, tannoy systems, making announcements in factories, that sort of thing. And I loved it. Variety, it was hands-on, practical. There were some people who were very unpleasant to work with, but for the most part, everyone was great fun to work with. And I learned a lot of really valuable practical skills that I'm still using yesterday, having some electrical work done on the house. So I was, doing some
soldering,
rewiring and things, and
yeah.
So loads of really practical, and it was just fun.
Brilliant.
Learned a lot. Felt like I was learning every day.
Yeah. Brilliant.
So that was a very different experience of learning to what I'd had at school. I didn't realize that till later.
Yeah.
So that was how. So it was kind of by accident, really, that I got into that line of work. It just happened to be a company that was doing an apprenticeship that always took apprentices from my school. The job sounded interesting. Traveling around different places, never been in the same place for more than a few days at a time. Lots of variety.
Problem solving,
doing something practical, learning something useful. Sounding great.
And then you went from there to BT.
Well, I went through a number of companies.
Yeah.
So from there to I was in the first company for 9 years. It got bought out, and then changed shape a couple of times, and then from there to a Canadian manufacturer. So that was traveling Europe, Middle East, North Africa. So a lot of time in Central Europe and places like Morocco.
Were you buying components and stuff? Was that?
No, designing and selling networks.
Systems.
So I designed bits of the internet in countries like Hungary and Czech Republic and Morocco and even in the UK, for probably some of your internet connections now, if you're buying them off people like Virgin or Sky or those sorts of people are running on bits of networks that I originally designed back in the 90s. So
that's cool.
Yeah, it was nice. That was a great job. That was a great job. But then, culture change destroyed that. Not the culture destroyed that business really, and it made it an unpleasant place to work. And then it got bought out, and it all disappeared anyway. And then I went to another company, and I was at the point there where really I should have become self-employed at that point.
Yeah.
But I went from then through three other companies, ended up at BT, took a voluntary redundancy package, and then used that to start my own business.
Well, I'm glad I asked those questions. So now we're at the point where you're going to do your 3-day NLP introduction.
Right. That was back in 93.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, that was back in 93. So when I left the industry was 2002. So
got it. But it was at BT, wasn't it?
No. It was back at a company that doesn't exist anymore, Mercury Communications.
I remember them. No, I remember them.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
I just want to get it in the timeline a little bit.
Yeah.
So you go to this introductory 3-day NLP program that everyone's raving about.
Yeah.
On the back of that, you do the 21-day book, which I love. It's one of the only books on NLP that's got about E prime in it.
Right.
Actually. And there'll be people here that are listening, that know about E prime. If you don't, it's an interesting subject to read about. Who was it who wrote all his books in E prime? I forget. Anyway, so you're at that stage. Now, the guy that taught you your introduction, did you find out anything about his background in NLP? What got him into NLP? Who did he train with? No idea.
I think probably McKenna Breen.
Really?
With Bandler, probably, as was back then. That was pretty much the only people that were doing NLP courses in the UK back then.
Okay.
He would have done his training maybe early 90s, maybe late 80s, early 90s.
Right. So
that was the heyday, really, of McKenna Breen's training.
Yeah. Okay. So this led to you, I don't know, maybe you mirrored people's body language back then in meetings, or
right.
So is that the kind of stuff you're talking about?
Yeah, and picking up on their sensory language and using, matching sensory language in return, and
all of that.
Well, stuff. Thinking in terms of well-formed outcomes and that sort of thing.
Yeah. And your interest in, because NLP now is such a broad field, right? Where for about 13 years I was studying NLP and keeping it quiet. Because as someone that was registered with a professional body, I didn't want anyone Googling NLP because there were too many wackos. Serious. Yeah. You could do an NLP course on how to pick up more women and get laid more.
Yeah.
And I thought, I don't really want my colleagues knowing that I study NLP because of the wackos that are out there. Where what intrigued me about NLP was the idea that all human experience has a structure. And NLP is the study of the structure of human experience.
Right.
That intrigued the life out of me. And modeling, really, I wanted to understand modeling. But everywhere I went to read about it and think about it, were telling me to imitate their body language and go into no mind. So that I'm serious. Everything I read about modeling left me thinking I still didn't know how to do it.
Yes.
All right. But it was this idea that since language, human experience has a structure that can be replicated in some way.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah.
And it wasn't until I was involved with your training that I felt that I was getting close to what modeling is. Now, I'm just interested in your journey to the point where you started to understand modeling and now write books on it, a methodology that is repeatable and all the rest of it.
Right.
I'm interested in your journey from that 3-day introduction to where you are now, which is, let's be honest, fairly controversial in some of your positions. You don't believe, inverted commas, in meta programs,
right?
You at conferences you say things like everything you've ever learned about NLP is wrong. So how did you get from the 3 days to where you are now?
Okay.
That will need editing. God,
So there
what a
was
waffle.
so there was the practical day-to-day, just using it in my job. And then when I was at BT, around about 2000, let me think. Yeah, 2000 or 2001, I then went on a consultancy skills course. And the guy that ran the course, who knew absolutely nothing about consultancy at all, he was actually a counselor and therapist and used NLP. And so NLP came up a lot in the course that he was running. And I think it was him that recommended NLP in 21 days to me. So I think I didn't read that book until after I'd, 9 years. I must have read other books. I think I'd read other books in the meantime. I'm sure Frogs into Princes and Using Your Brain for a Change and Transformations. And
the early ones.
Yeah. So then I think seeing this different way of using NLP, and I remember there was a specific moment where we had to role play this consultancy exercise, and this was at the time when Rover was being bought by BMW, and BMW were discovering all of these catastrophic problems in the Rover management and so on that they didn't know about when they bought the business.
Yeah.
And so we were doing this consultancy exercise where we had to role play that. So there were 3 people in the room playing Rover executives, and then the rest of us had to play this consulting team who would go in and find out what the problem was and then decide if we wanted to work with them and so on. And the way I felt about it was very similar to a lot of these sorts of experiences I've had where there's been these sorts of contrived training exercises, which is there's like a script and then there's the real point. And I have a tendency to ignore the script and just try and figure out what are we really trying to get at here?
Yeah.
And from what the guy had been telling us and showing us, the real objective of the exercise was getting precise empathy with these people. And everyone else was caught up in the role play. Hey, what are we going to call our consultancy business? It's like, it's a game. What does it matter? So they're getting all carried away with these 3 playing Rover executives. Oh, what's my job title going to be? It's not the point. The point is empathy. That's the right. So anyway, so the other people sent me in as the representative, which is another characteristic of my life. If something seems hard to do, or other people don't want to do it, I'll generally be the person who says, "Yeah, I'll do that."
Yeah,
because it sounds like more of a challenge, So, so they send me in. So I'm sitting there listening to these 3 guys role playing these Rover executives, and I'm trying to figure out. There's an emotion that's just below the surface here. And I'm trying to figure out what it is, and I'm not quite getting it. They're kind of hiding it behind the role play and so on. They were getting absorbed in that, and I kind of figured out what I thought it was, and I said, the sense I'm getting from you is the real issue here is about pride. And all 3 of them simultaneously looked like somebody had hit them with a brick.
Right.
They physically, the 3 of them, shot back in their chairs. And I just thought that I've absolutely hit the nail on the head there.
Yeah.
They didn't like it, was the interesting thing. And they didn't like being exposed in that way. But I felt it was accurate, just not, it's a role play. They're not real customers. We don't have to worry about upsetting them.
No.
Let's get to the point of the exercise and learn something.
Yeah.
So I think in that moment I thought, there's more to this. And I think that was when I then started. When I joined BT, there was an NLP practice group within BT. The guy running it was leaving to start his own hypnotherapy practice. So I took over running the group. Now, up until that point, he'd run 2 or 3 meetings a year.
Right.
And I moved that up to 1 a month, more than 1 a month, because we also had meetings taking place outside of London as well. Had people coming in like Jonathan Altfelt came in. John Seymour, Michael Breen. and Wendy Sullivan and Caitlin Walker. They're big names now in the clean language
I've
movement.
had Caitlin Walker on this show. So.
Right. Okay. So she was my first guest from when I took over the group in 2001, probably.
Symbolic modeling and all that.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. And she was just starting down that route back then with the clean language thing. So that was interesting. So loads of people came, had up to 90 people coming, had this big meeting room in London, 90, people attending. And that was great, ran that. And then I ended up going around the company. People were asking me to go and do talks about NLP at their team meetings.
Right.
So I'd go all over going and talking to people, which my boss's boss hated, because it meant I wasn't actually doing my job. But I never had anything to do anyway. I mean, I literally had almost no work to do at all. It was a complete ridiculous situation.
So you were effectively an in-house trainer at this point, or?
Right.
Or
yeah. By accident.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, so when the opportunity came up to take voluntary redundancy, I thought, well, I've got to work for myself, because I'm really sick of working in this corporate environment that only seems to exist to destroy people's sense of self-worth.
Yeah.
So I had to get out of that, and I didn't know what I was going to do. And so I just thought, well, I'll do this because this is interesting, and I'll do it for as long as I enjoy it. And if I stop enjoying it, I'll do something else.
Yeah.
And I'd always had it in my mind that, at some point I'll just go back to, doing DIY for people, or,
go back on the tools.
Yeah, basically. Yeah. I thought, well, I've always got that I can do if I'm, if I want, if I get bored of this.
Yeah. Well, you do quite a few things, don't you? I mean, you've got your publishing.
Yeah. I'm a trustee of a couple of school academy trusts.
You've got a lot going on.
Yeah, on the committee of the local CIPD branch. CIPD is the professional body for people professionals. So yeah, quite a lot going on.
And you've trained all around the world. China, India. I want to get, because we've been talking for nearly 40 minutes, which is lovely, and I'm enjoying it. But what I want to ask you, what's wrong with the kind of current public view of NLP? I mean, what's wrong with NLP at the minute?
Well, it's interesting, because earlier you were talking about the public perception and what your colleagues might think. I never had that, because, when I started learning NLP, there really wasn't an internet for this sort of stuff to be on. You bought a book or you went on a training course, that was it.
Yeah.
And I was in a world where NLP was being used in sales and customer service, consultancy, and so on. There was no credibility issue.
Right.
There was no, and I think the problem with NLP is the same for any field of study, really, which is there's a time when the vast majority of people working in a field have passed through all these barriers of entry to get to where they are, and they don't like anything that disrupts that.
Right.
Because that affects their livelihoods. So we don't want people, anaesthetists don't want people knowing that there's the possibility of, hypnosis for anesthesia. Now, I don't know if that's the case or not.
Well, no, I understand what you're saying.
As an example.
Yeah.
And so people who are currently in the world of NLP don't like people coming along with something new or some new model, because, oh no, that's not the way that it was 40 years ago. Well, the human being hasn't changed a lot in 40 years, but our ability to study the workings of a human being has changed. It's unrecognizable now when you think back to the psychology experiments of the 1980s, 70s, and 80s versus the sophistication that we have now.
Yeah.
Unrecognizable. So of course we know things now about how the mind works that it wasn't possible to know back in the 70s and 80s. But the problem is, it's like the invention of dark matter in physics. We've got these great equations that explain almost everything, but they don't quite work. So we make up this exotic compound matter that nobody's ever seen and can't be measured to explain why the equations don't work. And it's the same in every field, I think. And in the case of NLP, we can't explain how do we, how do the senses work, and how do we get from 5 senses into, so we invent this thing of submodalities. But
Yeah.
if you understand that there are in fact at least 22 senses, you don't need submodalities. So
well, you can still call them submodalities.
You can if you want.
In that sense, you know what I mean?
But I think it's a distinction between, okay, we know what we're really talking about is 22 distinct senses.
Yeah.
And thinking there really are these things called submodalities, which can't exist anywhere in the physical body. And therefore they are an invention on the part of the practitioner to explain something that otherwise they can't explain.
Yeah, no, I get that.
And the same with what you were saying about meta programs. They're not intrinsic in the processing of the brain. They're an imposition of the observer.
Yeah.
The observer saying, hey, I can see a difference between these two things.
Yeah.
So I'll call one of them red and I'll call one of them green. And now red and green are a thing.
Yeah.
And now that we've made red and green a thing, they are the only things that people will see.
Human beings do seem to have a tendency to gravitate towards fundamentalism.
Yeah.
And dogma.
Yeah.
And maybe that's, has some evolutionary advantage, pattern recognition over time.
I think so. Yeah, definitely an evolutionary advantage, because one of the things that our senses are doing is generalizing input. So, you walked, how many doors have you walked through this morning?
Yeah, 5, 6.
And did you have to stop at each one and think, oh,
no,
what's this thing? I can't get into this room.
No.
What do I, oh, there's a thing. What happens if I,
no,
all the doors you've ever walked through.
Yeah.
You've never stopped, rarely ever stopped and trying to figure out how to open a door.
No.
And even doors you've never seen before. So the ability to generalize sensory input is vital when the world is not precise and mass produced.
Yeah.
If we take something that's precise and mass produced, like like a pen.
Yeah.
Well, if I had 10 of these, which I probably have, you'd be hard pushed to tell the difference between them.
Yeah.
But 10 cats,
different.
You easily recognize the difference between them.
Yeah. It's like I can get into a hire car, right?
Right, exactly.
And I generalize straight away. And I was thinking about this the other day. If you think about human beings processing glucose as the main source of energy, the brain takes 30% of that. That's with this fabulous ability to generalize about our actions. Imagine if we had to think about every door we open.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
be fucked, right?
So we have to generalize, because otherwise we would have to stop and think about every new sensory experience that we're having. But then the downside of that is we stop looking at the world. That's a door. Yeah. Oh, did you see that beautiful door? It's just a door. What?
Yeah.
What's special about it?
Yeah.
And so a lot of practices like mindfulness, I think, are trying to undo the process of generalization to see the world through fresh eyes.
Yeah.
And there's a quote from Rachel Carson, an American environmentalist, about this. I always remember it is on one of the little notice boards at the Everglades National Park in Florida. And it's about the way that a child sees the world as being fresh and new and exciting, and adults lose that ability to see the world in that naive way.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of practices that get people to kind of undo that. But I think the natural state is to generalize, because we wouldn't last 5 minutes without it. If a lion came towards them and we thought, oh, it's interesting. It's like that thing I saw yesterday, but it's not exactly the same. So this one must be safe.
Yeah. Generalize and predict based on past experience.
It's got teeth. If it's, coming at you, it's dangerous.
Yeah.
And from a survival point of view, it's better to err on the side of caution. It's better to be far away and wrong than up close and right. Far away and wrong rather than up close. And, it was a lion after all.
Well, it's probably why human beings seem to be really good at catastrophizing this imagined future.
Yeah,
because those that were able,
which is the safest thing.
Yeah, makes sense.
And in corporate risk assessment, which I have to get involved in through the school trusts, that's organized catastrophizing.
Yeah.
Worrying about all the things that possibly could go wrong.
Yeah.
And then trying to figure out, can we stop it and can we prevent it and what's the impact going to be and so on.
Yeah.
But the structure stops people from. I think the tendency is to worry, and then the worry leads to being incapacitated, and then that's no use to anybody.
No. Well, the thing that really drew me to your training, you know, I was lucky enough to do a master practitioner training that you did a weekend on. We shan't get into all of that weekend because it was a bit bizarre, but your weekend was by far the best training of that whole master prac. So that attracted me. That's all right. I've told you that many times before, but that attracted me to you as a trainer. Then anchoring.
Right.
Now, I had, you know, learned anchoring back because I read Tony Robbins' book, Awaken the Thing Within, that got me into NLP, bizarrely. And I anchoring was what? I'm pretending, really. It never seemed to have any impact on me at all because I learned NLP, you know, calibrate, look at them when the state is at its peak, anchor it, you know, and all that. Just never worked for me or for those I work with at all, right?
And it's not even how the brain's working anyway. So it's just
exactly
a contrivance. And you raise an important point there, which is that when we see people on training courses at the front of a room having this amazing experience, we must not forget that they are taking part in a demonstration in front of a room full of people.
Yeah.
And there's a pressure on them
to
perform, and they will.
Yeah, which is probably why there was a mismatch with my expectations because of what I was seeing in demonstrations and experiencing myself.
Yeah,
you know, because I'm seeing these people performing and acting, and then when I on myself or whatever, when I'm using it, it wasn't working. So when I saw you, you did a presentation. Everything you've ever heard about NLP is wrong, or something like
everything
that.
you know about NLP is wrong. At the NLP conference a few years back.
Yeah. I would say the teaching and the experience I've had since learning about spike time dependent plasticity and its importance in the context of anchoring, it's led to an increase in my ability to use NLP in almost every area that I can think of, right? And I see that anchoring is so fundamental. The understanding of it is so fundamental to the model of NLP. It just bemuses me. I mean, even the other day, someone on YouTube was saying they've given up using anchoring because it doesn't work. And I just said, well, have you heard of spike time dependent plasticity? And they said, no. And I said, well, the fact that you don't understand that is why it isn't working for you.
Yeah.
Right. But that is so fundamental.
Well, I think the funny thing is that nobody questions the fact that in the lungs, there are specialized cells that you don't find anywhere else, and they are specialized for gas exchange. Yeah. And you find cells in the kidneys that are specialized for what they do, and cells in the pancreas that are specialized for what they do. Nobody questions that because everybody says, well, that's the job of the pancreas, or that's the job of the, I don't know, the liver or whatever.
I get the idea, yeah.
And so what's the brain specialized for? The cells in the brain are specialized for connecting. That's all they do. All they do is connect.
Yeah.
And how do they connect? Through growing connections to each other when they are presented with certain types of input.
Yeah.
We don't question, well, you know, what happens when you put oxygen into a lung, when it goes in, you know, and so on. We don't worry about that.
No.
But people come up with all these weird and wonderful theories about what the mind's doing and about things like anchoring and learning and the experience of self and the experience of reality, and trying to overcomplicate it, because I think it's a human thing. You know, back in the Victorian times, when Darwin was plagiarizing the idea of evolution through natural selection from a bunch of other people.
Harsh.
Well, he popularized it.
Yeah.
But he wasn't the person who
no, I know,
discovered it, but he popularized it.
No, I know.
As is often the case. And a lot of Victorians didn't like the theory because they didn't like to think that a human being in our great intellect and civilization is in any way related or descended from
bonobos.
Monkeys or you know, uncivilized animals. So they didn't like it. And I think the same thing happens today. We don't like the fact that our rich experience of life and all of my opinions that are so important to me are nothing more than
conditioned response.
Yeah, in response to stuff that I've experienced in my life that just happened to be taking place at the same time. I don't like being rejected that,
well, it
so
seems to diminish.
Complicate it.
I get that, but it seems to diminish free will, doesn't it? To a certain extent, it does. Because in this moment, right, the vast majority of the behaviors that are automatically coming out of Mark Harris, I didn't decide.
Well, why did you just ask me that question?
No idea.
Because of what I'd said previously.
Oh yeah, good. Yeah, I get that. But then
so in a conversation, we're always constrained by what came before. Of course. We're not going to change the subject and start talking about the price of bananas.
No, although now you mention it, they are rather expensive. But I was reading an article the other day, Peter, that was, and it's quite old, but it was a piece of research that was looking at people making arbitrary choices, and they were wired up, and the parts of the brain responsible for generating the motor output to make the choice was stimulated before the conscious mind of the person making the choice knew they were going to choose.
Yeah.
Right. Now, I know there are some issues around the research design. We're talking about arbitrary choices, not longer term choices that someone is thinking about.
Right.
So that's an important distinction. But with that distinction, that evidence does tend to suggest that I'm not consciously choosing to do anything.
I think in the short term, when you're reacting to the outside environment, I think that's true.
Yeah.
I think long-term planning is where you have free choice.
Yeah, that's
when you're in the moment, you don't have any choice.
Yeah,
you will react however you are programmed to react.
Agreed. And that's a good way of reading that evidence, because some people have taken the evidence and says, there you go, no free choice, no free will as such.
I think it's why I say a lot on training and to coaching clients as well, that, if you wait till you're in, say, the stressful situation, it's too late.
Yeah.
You will go in there thinking, right, I'm going to do this differently. Right, if my boss says this, I'm not going to react, whatever. You have no choice at that point. So what you've got to do, all your preparation, all of your decision making has to take place beforehand.
Yeah.
So that when they're in this situation, you can just react. And, and this has been written about loads of times, things like flow states, and, we practice and things like armed forces, emergency services, doctors, midwives, they practice.
Yeah.
They don't practice when they're in the operating theatre. They practice away from that, so that when they're in the high stress environment, they are just reacting, but their reactions are then in accordance with decisions they made previously when they have more resources at their disposal.
Yeah. I mean, people will colloquially talk about muscle memory, won't they? It's what they mean, isn't it?
I think so. Yeah. It's just
what they mean.
It's and muscle memory. We're talking about lower level connections to the motor cortex, the motor output. So and in the research that you're talking about, what was happening was the motor output was activating before the person became consciously aware that there was a decision to make, which I think we've all experienced.
Yeah.
We've all jumped and reacted to something, and then had the sensation of momentarily afterwards realizing what it was we were reacting to.
Yeah.
It's easier if you watch somebody else do it, because what's happening is your brain is editing out the timing delay. So you think your reactions are fast, but they're really not. But if you can watch somebody else going through it, and you watch like YouTube videos of cats, one cat surprising another, you'll see this timing delay between the reaction and the awareness.
Yeah.
And I think that's the reaction is, there aren't separate brains or anything like that, but the reaction is taking place at lower level, shorter connections in the brain. And then the thinking making is taking place at higher level, as in physically closer to the outside of the brain, and therefore longer connections. And because they're longer, they take longer.
Yeah.
Because the laws of physics say that electrical signals will pass along your nerves at a certain speed and no faster than that. So there will always be a delay.
Yeah.
And what the brain's very good at doing is predicting the delay and then editing it out, so we're not aware of it.
Wow.
If you couldn't do that, you could never catch anything. because by the time you've seen a ball or a frisbee or something, by the time you've seen it, it's already somewhere else.
Yeah.
Because of the time it takes the nerve impulses to get from your retina to your brain to be processed, to figure out what it is you're seeing. And so the only way we could catch something like that is by predicting where it's going to be.
And then
And all
moving
of
there.
that's done through this super complicated network that's built through trial and error, through spike time independent plasticity, as you say.
Wow. And I mean, all of that was you pointing out that maybe all this kind of woo-woo, sophisticated or metaphor type stuff is driven by the fact that acknowledging the simplicity of stimulus in, output out would be too demeaning to the human being. But then you just described all that, and that is mind-blowing to me.
See, maybe it's the engineer in me. I don't know, but I would go to, I used to love as a child going to the Museum of Science and Industry in Birmingham and seeing these big Victorian machines that were making things like buttons and needles and hat pins and stuff like that. And these machines are incredibly simple. And yet what the Victorians did was they made them beautiful. They weren't just functional. They had designs, and they had these polished brass plaques, and they were made to look elegant. And the way they work is, if you've ever watched these sorts of programs like How It's Made and so on, I admire all of the thought that's gone into how to make these things, but then the action that they then produce, they're churning out 1 million hat pins a day, is not complicated.
No,
we couldn't say that machine is intelligence, but all of the intelligence went into making it. And then when they made it last forever. 100, 150 years later, these things are still working in the museum, still making pins, paper clips, whatever it is that they're doing. And I admire, it's what I call elegance. I admire that elegance. It's simplicity. It's simple. It's efficient. It does exactly what it's there to do, and it will do it forever. These machines will outlast us, and our decisions that we make today will outlast us, because they are shaping the world that our children will grow up in.
Right. Well, we've been talking an hour, and I am going to ask, I really want you to come back on next year, should you have time.
Yes.
I'd like to spend time in our next episode talking about the process of modeling a behavior.
Yeah.
Because that seems to me the heart of NLP.
Yeah.
And there's not much clarity out there on how to do it.
I agree.
I think we'd agree on that. And even though we would both say that NLP is the study of the structure of human experience, and all human experience has structure, and we'd point to the early history where modeling of various, inverted commas, people that produced excellence was at the heart of NLP. For all of that, there's a lot of vagueness and woo-woo. So the next episode, I'd love you to come on and talk about modeling and how we can actually model in such a way that enhance our performance, both in business and personally. Yeah,
definitely. I think what's happened over the 40 years or so is Bandler, Grinder, and all the people who they were researching and developing with, that knowledge has been passed on through successive generations who've learned something incompletely, added their own metaphors and understandings and experiences and stuff from other practices and fields. And some of the simple stuff has stayed pretty much the same.
Yeah.
So, some of the simple techniques and principles, they're exactly as they were 40 years ago. But a lot of other stuff has, I think, devolved because, like you've said with anchoring, people have done the course, gone home, can't get it to work. They either stop using it, or they make up a story about how to get it to work.
Yeah.
You have to do it this way, and you have to think of the color. It has to be the color pink. No, you can't think of red. No, it has to be pink. It's because of the special reasons in your brain.
Or they say, I don't do anchoring. I do internal dialogue, like the woman on the video.
Right. So we have these successive layers where people add their own stuff, their own contrivances to get things to work. And then the people who are going on training courses today, for example, are being taught that meta model is just some questions you could ask in a coaching session. Or they're not being taught meta model at all. because their trainer doesn't understand meta models, so they just don't teach it. And so what we end up with is this diluting or devolving of some of the core principles.
Yeah.
Because successive generations of trainers haven't understood them, and therefore that knowledge doesn't get passed on.
I got it.
And I think there isn't, in the field of NLP, there hasn't been the ongoing rigor of research and peer review that would correct that in any other institution. In a university, if a lecturer or professor is saying, oh, well, I don't understand quantum physics, so I'm not going to teach that. I'm going to teach people that the universe was made by fairies. That would get identified and removed.
It would fairly early on. Yeah.
Because of the system of peer review and academic research and rigor. That isn't there in NLP.
No, it's not.
And so these fairy tales get to persist, and people latch onto them because, oh, wow, I really love the way that they explained it. It made total sense to you.
Yeah.
Okay, it made sense to you, but can you reproduce it? Oh, well, I know I don't need to. I know it in myself, so that's all I need. And it's not.
No.
An engineer's dreams don't stay in their heads. They make real things in the world that people can live in and drive and fly in and walk across and so on.
Yeah.
So that's the ultimate test, is can it exist in the real world?
Yeah.
And I think that's true for NLP. And that was where my journey started, is what is happening? What can I achieve in the real world? And can I reproduce it? And can I come up with a way of explaining it that enables other people to reproduce it? And that's the essence of modeling. Yes. Is it teachable? Is it reproducible? If yes, then we must therefore understand the mechanism that creates that result.
Yeah, and then we get into the internal decision points that are happening outside of consciousness of the expert or the... Anyway, that's getting into our next interview. So winding up then, Peter, where can people get in contact with you, find out about the next trainings, stuff you've got going on? That the YouTube version of this will be out straight away within the next 2 days. So with that in mind, the audio version will be next year.
Okay, so my main website is genius.coach. And if you want a shortcut to see NLP training dates, then that's genius.training.
Yes.
Those are real URLs. There's nothing missing. Genius.coach, genius.training. That will take you to a couple of different places where you can find general information about me, and then specifically information about upcoming training and events.
Brilliant. And I'll make sure they're in the show notes, along with the link to your free NLP Foundation Think course.
Yes.
Which is fabulous. Anyway, thanks, Pete, for being with us. And thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Bye.